And we are live. Hello, everybody, and welcome to Modern Web State of Web Performance. So excited to have you all here today. If you're tuning in, make sure to say hi in the comments. I see a lot of people saying hi in the comments right now. Excited again to have you all. I'm going to go ahead and share my slides really quickly. Welcome again. We're going to have a really amazing panel today of web performance experts, and stick your questions in chat and we will try to get to all of them. Wanted to thank a few of our sponsors today. So first sponsor is Progress Kendo React. So if you all are not familiar, Kendo React is a professional UI component library built from the ground up for React. There's about 90 components. They're all engineered with performance in mind and can handle massive data sets. So check it out. There's a free trial as well, kendoreact.com. Also, Dexecure. So Dexecure is a company that optimizes websites with a single line of code and hopefully helps you get back to like what you're interested in doing. So whether that's JavaScript, CSS, HTML, fonts, third-party assets, whatever, Dexecure optimizes them and tries to always serve the best version of your website to your audience. So you can go to dexecure.com/modernwebpodcast and check that out if you want. And that will give you your first month free if you sign up for a basic or pro plan, or there's a free account as well. So, and then, last but not least, This.Labs. So I love working at This. We have an amazing team. We've grown to about 50 developers now. It's really fun. You can always email us jobs@This. We love our clients. We get to work with some really cool people on really cool projects, whether that be like open source related things or building out really cool applications or helping with migrations and strategy. It's a fun place. I like to think it's a fun place. And we're basically hiring across all technologies. So if you're interested, come hang out, whether it's a project manager, whether it's an engineering manager, senior software engineer, et cetera, et cetera. And we also have a really amazing apprentice program too. Part of this thought is we love to do events for the community. We just really believe in making the dev world a better place. That's why we started the company. So some upcoming events we have. React Contributor Days is coming up September 9th. That is a really amazing event where so many different React contributors come together, hang out for a few hours, and talk about things within the ecosystem. Then we have JavaScript Marathon, which is basically like a week-long free training. So if you just want free training all week long, check out javascriptmarathon.com. We also do monthly mentoring for women in tech. It's been an amazing place to meet new women, safe space. Doesn't have to be, you don't have to be a junior developer or a senior developer or whatever. Just come hang out. There's tons of topics to talk about there. And it's just again, a fun place to be. Then we also have Angular World Tour happening. So if you go to angularworldtour.com, you'll see a bunch of Angular events. That'll happen sometime very soon, and React World Tour will be launched very soon as well. So we have some amazing hosts today. So Katie is one of our hosts who is at Etsy. Katie, do you want to just really quickly, 10-second intro?
Yeah, hi, I'm Katie Seiler-Miller, to disambiguate because we have two Katies today. You can call me KSM. That's what folks at work call me. So I've been a front-end engineer for about 16 years now. I've been at Etsy for the last almost 6 years, where I specialize in web performance, front-end architecture, design systems, the future of front-end, things like that. So thanks for having me.
Yes, thank you. And we also have Rob Ocel.
Yeah, hi everybody. My name's Rob Ocel, on Twitter at RoboCell, which for the sly of you, notice my name spelled slightly incorrectly. I'm an architect at This.Labs, been doing software consulting for about 14 years and doing professional web development for about the last 6. Happy to be here.
And Rob, for the past, 3 years, is web performance is going to be the thing this year. So really always pushing web performance at This and focusing on trying to make our engineers better with that. Have some amazing panelists here today as well. And I'll go ahead and have you all do quick intros, maybe starting with Alex first. Oh, you're muted, by the way, Alex, or I can't hear you either way. I don't know if you're muted. Well, we'll have you figure that out. Yeah, we'll have other
I'll jump
Katie.
in.
Yeah, for sure.
Hey, I'm Katie Pennius, or KDH for disambiguation purposes. I do DevRel for Core Vitals at Google. Yeah.
Cool. So glad to have you here. And Yoav, go ahead and introduce yourself as well.
Sure. So, hi, I'm Yoav Weiss. I work on the Chrome team at Google on the speed metrics team, and I've been doing web performance related things for the last 2 decades. So, one would hope we would have solved this by now, but no luck.
It's always a struggle to get to where you want to be. And if you're like me, I'm Asian mom, right? Like, all right, we got somewhere, but that's not enough. And I feel like web performance, especially as the platform grows and technologies grow, we're always like that. Alex, do you want to try again? Oh no. It was like perfect before, but now we can't hear you. Well, I'll introduce Alex really quickly. Some of you may know Alex from his time at Google, but he recently joined Microsoft and is partner program manager there. You can follow him on Twitter at Slightly Late, and he's always a wealth of information when it comes to web performance.
Is this thing on?
Yes, there we go.
All right, hey. Yeah, Tracy, you got it. Apologies for all of that.
No, that's okay. Yeah, awesome. We're very excited to have you. Cool. So without further ado, I guess we'll hand it over to Rob and KSM and probably start with updates from everybody. So Rob, I'll let you take it away, kick us off, and we'll go from there.
Yeah. So this is state of. So we're going to hear from our panelists. Of course, we have some questions on our side. They have some updates that they would like to share with everybody. But I'm sure all of you are coming with questions of your own. So please drop your comments, questions, and other sort of thoughts into the chat, and we will happily bring them up for our panelists to ask. But to start out, why don't we just do a little bit of a round robin of sort of updates or things that, our opinions, our initial thoughts on web performance and the state of web performance. And we will start with Katie.
Yes, I guess to start, obviously, Core Vitals has been a big deal in the field of web performance, and that's something I work on. I think some of the things that we're looking at are like, what are the big blockers to people being able to hit Core Vitals thresholds? And so a couple of things come to mind. I think we're seeing a lot about fonts. Fonts are interesting because I think there's something that people don't think about a lot, and there's something like you said it once and you forget about it, but how you handle your font loading determines when you can see text and also cause layout shifts. So we've been trying to put out guidance around that, as well as like introduce new APIs that make it easier to match fallback fonts to your web font so there's no layout shifts. What else is going on? Some other stuff I'm working on is trying to work with teams at Google on their performance of their products. So hopefully like some of the libraries and products that you work on that are built by Google, you'll see some performance improvements there. Yeah, and then another thing I've been working on recently is signed exchanges. So signed exchanges are neat because they take your web content and make it very cacheable. And once content is very easily cacheable, it makes it easy to deliver it almost instantly because it's very easy to be served from all these different caches. And so that's exciting because if we want to see like really drastic improvements in things like LCP, you would need a technology like signed exchanges. So those are some of the things I'm thinking about and I'm excited about at the moment.
Very exciting. Yeah. And hopefully we'll get back around to talk a little bit more about the signed exchanges, because that definitely sounds like something that I remember, I think, watching a presentation on a while back, but have not seen a lot of updates about. So I think people might be really interested to find out about how they can see more about that and maybe get involved with it in the future. But next, we will go to Yoav. Do you want to give us a little bit of an introduction?
Sure. Like I said, I'm currently working as part of Chrome's Speed Metrics team. I used to work in Chrome DevRel before, and been working as part of the web performance, and like been working on Chromium for many years before that. So currently my main focus is on the definition and implementation of the different core web vital metrics, as well as other performance monitoring APIs. I'm also co-chairing the web performance working group. So for the folks listening, if you are a developer that's interested in the web performance space and want to get more involved in how the sausage is made, feel free to hit me up. And I'm also, like, in terms of questions on that front, I'm always happy to answer questions. And we're always looking for fresh web developer perspectives as part of the working group, which I think is critical for web standards in general.
Awesome. Thanks so much. And last but certainly not least, Alex, do you want to give us a little bit of an update of how things are going for you and how you're seeing web performance these days?
Sure. So I'm mostly trying to figure out how to unmute myself in various new tools and systems now that I've changed jobs. This happens more often than you might think. But when that's not occupying most of my time, I kind of think about performance a bit from a sort of platform strategy level, thinking backwards from how can we make the web successful in the lives of most people most of the time. If you think of the mission of the web as the platform that should catch most of people's computing, then we have to make that a nice place to land. It has to be a good experience most of the time. You have to want to not throw your laptop out a window or your phone at a wall every time something's very slow. And so that gets me my interest in web performance from the perspective of how do we get that baseline, meet that baseline user expectation of this feels good and I would like to keep using it. And so there's so much exciting stuff that's happening. You know, Google's working on Core Web Vitals, and it's interesting to me to see how the pieces are coming into play kind of as we might have expected them to from the Core Web Vitals perspective. So Katie's talking about spending time on libraries and third-party scripts that are getting pulled into people's sites, you know, sometimes without their knowledge. Not that they didn't like explicitly do it, but because they might have, again, fired and forgotten about that sort of thing. And so that's the sort of pressure that we would expect to see play out. At the same time, I'm also interested to see what's happening at the device and network level. So I've been, over the last couple of years, keeping a close eye on that and watching how it's progressing. I put together a blog post earlier this year sort of talking about what I think the lay of the land is going to continue to look like for the next couple of years at the low end. And so keeping tabs on that is taking a lot of my focus on performance.
Awesome. Thank you. And that's where I think I want to start with first. You know, one of the things that we've seen over the last year and a half, I mean, certainly for a longer running period of time, but I think everything to do with COVID and people sort of being inside their homes has accelerated people using the internet for way more things than they even had been previously. So what I'm curious is, based on your guys' experience in the metrics that you have access to, what is the state of play and how has things changed with respect to both devices and internet speeds as it pertains to web performance? Has all these people coming online, has that lowered the general speeds at which they're accessing, or the average device on which they're accessing the internet? Or is it that people have prioritized upgrades because of the needs for being online and it's actually maybe gone up instead? How does that look from what you all have access to see?
I can try to answer that, but I assume that Yoav and Katie will have better better fine-grained data to add. Are you familiar with the idea of a K-shaped recovery? Like this discussion about how in the US, at least, coming out of COVID, folks who are doing sort of poorly economically were going to like continue to do poorly, and people who are doing well were doing even better. That's kind of what the world has looked like from a performance perspective. It's kind of K-shaped. At the low end, we are seeing that the low end has kind of been, you know, a dead cat bouncing off of a very specific set of network configurations and CPU designs, at least on low-end mobile, for a couple of years now. And that has meant that the low end has not gotten that much faster year on year. And that correlates explicitly with what you were talking about in places where we've got first internet users, people who are coming online for the first time or whose first computer is being bought, be that a phone or a laptop. Those folks are not seeing a huge year-on-year gain in terms of that. And so the volume of those folks coming online changes the performance picture for everyone. While at the top end, things are just really pulling away, right? Like I talked to developers who have an M1 MacBook, and then they think everything was really fast on their, previous i9, and you're like, well, okay, that's nice. That's also sort of not where that huge surge in Chromebook sales is. There are no i9 Chromebooks. There's no M1 Chromebooks, right? All of those devices are being sold, statistically speaking, to folks in the $200 to $300 range for a computer, not the $2,000 range. So if you just think about like growth as a proxy for low end or mid tier, that gets you a pretty good mental model. So how fast is computing growing right now is maybe a good way to think about how much of our user base is going to be using the slowest cohort of devices. Does that match up with what you're seeing in the data for Core Web Vitals and that sort of thing, Katie? Because I know that those are all based on real world metrics, which is to say they bounce off of the runtime, they get reported back through a service that Google runs, and then are reported back to us as sort of, per website metrics. But does that sort of reflect the same picture?
Off the top of my head, I could pull up the HB archive has these charts. You can see how LCP and all that stuff has changed over a year. And off the top of my head, I don't remember what the trend there is, but just what you're saying makes sense. Like I think the top end grows much quicker than like the bottom end does. So all you're really seeing is that like the range of devices and possible experiences just gets bigger from year to year. And in regards to like say the past year in particular, it was interesting. When the pandemic started, I was like very interested in like how is the pandemic changing people's internet usage patterns. When you first said this question, I was like, oh, I did with all this research on this and I can't remember. Like I guess I just lost a lot of brain cells over the past year. But I was looking that up while you were talking, and it seems like the data does show that like some of it's just like people are on different networks. They used to be on their office networks during the day. Now they're on their home networks. And for most people, like I know I'm an example, I went from like top of the line office network to being on a hotspot, and it was not the same. And I think overall I've seen there's just like much more internet traffic. How that translates into Core Web Vitals, I'm not sure. Because I think a lot of that gets down to like probably latency. So like if anything, you're going to see the difference in LCP, but just like talking to people, I've talked to so many people who are like, well, we can't have like both of us on the internet at the same time, like while our kid is trying to do school, like crashes or something. And so I think this year, in my opinion, has kind of at least indirectly like highlighted the importance of caring about performance and building efficient websites. But to get back to your original question, I did not answer, but those are my thoughts.
Yeah. So from my perspective, I don't believe that we split the Crux data by we don't split it by network type, because that would significantly decrease coverage. Just from a privacy perspective, it would limit, it would lower the number of samples we have, and that would reduce the number of sites that actually get scores. But yeah, my hunch is aligns very much with what you're seeing. I think that there was also at least the early stages of the pandemic, a lot of back-end performance, a big back-end performance problem from just folks getting more online and hitting services that weren't scaled up to be hit as much. And I think Katie published something on that front in terms of just better caching and general best practices for backend services that are being hit. And this is Katie, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think this is like something that you published right when the pandemic hit to try to alleviate some of that pressure.
Yeah.
So at least at the beginning, we were definitely seeing a big shift in the way that folks are accessing, and I think it only emphasized the importance of performance of all kinds. So back end, front end.
Yeah, and I guess if anyone's curious, I pulled up the HTTP archive charts while we were talking, and actually there has been like this precipitous decline. Oh wait, no, that means it's improving. Never mind. I shouldn't try to interpret data and be on a podcast at the same time. Yeah.
Well, actually, on that point, there was a comment or a question in the chat saying that Michael saw some recent data that the low end improved the most, and India and Africa improved 2 times on things like LCP. I wonder, does anyone have any thoughts or follow-up or comments on that?
Yeah, so India has been a particularly bright spot with the rollout of Reliance Jio, kind of taking the entire nation, which is just incredible and vast in scale, by storm over the last 3 years. I wrote a piece earlier this year talking about kind of how that's evolved, where I think we don't actually have to think about slow 3G anymore. Actually, kind of on our baseline scenario, we can upgrade to thinking about slow 4G as a baseline, and that has dramatically improved the sort of network baseline, even if the devices themselves have not gotten that much faster. So there is good news in this sort of ecosystem-wide. And we are about to hit an inflection point where the slowest chips are going to come up off the 28 nanometer process and into 14 and 10 in the next couple of years. So I'm looking, it's weird for me to say this, but I'm cautiously optimistic that our low end is going to continue to get somewhat better, which is great news.
That's interesting. So a question that I had actually kind of to follow up to that, Alex, is I know that something that's been a big topic in the kind of performance world for the last several years is how do we get engineers to build that empathy for users who are on lower end devices when they are using, an M1 MacBook really fast chip. Do you feel as though we're doing a better job of making sure that we're taking into account folks on slower connections and older devices, or do you think this is still something that the industry needs to improve on?
I'd suggest that the great work that Katie and Yoav are doing to try to get the community to care, by causing the business to care, is going to be the thing that gets us to eventually get there. I think no amount of jawboning, mine or from folks who have, a better way with words, has caused anyone to really change their perspective in terms of, sitting down in front of their laptop and choosing what to do. Certainly not at a statistical perspective level. So I'm very optimistic from Core Web Vitals' perspective about how it can cause people to want to change in ways that they have been somewhat resistant to. Are we doing a better job? I don't see it there is a communication aspect of Core Web Vitals, which is to say Google saying, by the way, it's coming, has had, I think, a salutary effect around the edges, certainly with a lot of some of the larger automated publishers. If you look at like a Wix or a Squarespace, the threat of Core Web Vitals is at least a signaling mechanism that has caused some big publishers to move, which has had a big improvement at the margins. So that's been great. What will continue that? It probably won't be asking developers to care more. It'll probably be more like Core Web Vitals.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I mean, like on my developer machine, even if I use the CPU throttling, it's still fairly fast in the grand scheme of things. And then on top of that, like a lot of times your development environment, like there is no like lag in server response. There is no latency. There's like all these things where like you could try to like simulate it and make it more realistic, but you're going to like run up against things like your code is packaged differently locally than it is in production. I think ultimately like the sustainable solution is just get people to care more about this and measure and understand like what performance your users are encountering in the wild.
Yeah, and just to continue that line of thought, I think like caring only goes only will take you some of the way there if you're going against the business, but aligning the business with with the right incentives will hopefully get us there.
So I think it can be sometimes taken for granted, especially in the web performance sphere, that this is not widely known. But for the perspective of people that may not be aware, do you have a sense of who the average web user is? I know it depends so much on country, depends so much on each individual site and what their customer base looks like. But do you have a sense of something that you can easily share with people that can give us perspective on who is the average person, the 50% mark on the web these days?
So I want to preface everything else by saying that when we're looking at performance, or when you're looking at anything in a marketplace, the market is made at the margin. So that is to say, it isn't what the median person would value a stock at that is the price of the stock. It is what the last person to buy and sell it would buy and sell it for that defines the price for everyone. And so it's the marginal addressable user that's the one that is valuable to the business. And so the business making a choice about whether or not I'm going to take someone's money half the time, right, the 50% mark, because the same user can be the same user in many different performance scenarios. So I like to compare and contrast sort of not just the user who is disadvantaged in some way, or from a sort of economic perspective or from a geographic perspective, but that same user's experience could be replicated by getting onto an airplane and trying to use the Wi-Fi there, right? And so every executive in every business has, at least until recently, had that same experience. And they are, in general, both the most advantaged and most connected. So it's not as though these are static quantities. And if your experience is great 75% of the time, that means every fourth click or tap, on average, you're delivering a bad experience. And that can be the same user through the same session. So I kind of want to break the idea of the median user, because I think the median user is perhaps misleading. And I want to talk about the P75 and the P90 user, because if you improve life for those users, in general, you tend to improve it for the median as well. But you improve it for the same user as they approach the end of the distribution too. And that is the thing that has the most value. I think that's why Yoav and Katie and I will talk about, the P75, P90, P95 user. But we can share more, I think, about characterizing them if that would be helpful.
And to kind of riff on that point, I think sometimes people use the idea of a median user as an excuse to not pursue performance, because they're like, well, my business only cares about iPhone users. And that may be totally true, but that doesn't necessarily mean that your experience is good even for iPhone users. I say that as someone who has an iPhone. And so I think sometimes pushing the median internet user idea too hard leads people to think oh, they don't need to take any action.
So just kind of shifting gears a slight little bit. So we've been talking quite a bit about core web vitals. And I absolutely agree. Could not agree more that it's become a lever that you can use to get businesses to care. But I'm wondering, now that we've had core web vitals around for a while, have y'all found that they are an accurate proxy for performance that teams can use? Is there still something that's missing, or are you finding that yes, when we go in and we look at things like business metrics, KPIs, try to correlate them with these core web vitals, we're seeing that it is actually moving the needle on the things that folks care about?
I'll jump in on that one. I don't think they're perfect, but in some ways I think that's by design, because in my mind, one of the problems that Core Web Vitals set out to solve was the idea that even just picking the performance metrics that you care about could in and of itself be a project and be difficult. And so just saying these are pretty good, they're pretty generic, we think they're going to work for most people, let's work with that, is a good starting point. And companies that are more sophisticated and have the bandwidth will supplement those with their own like business specific metrics. Yeah.
Yeah, and yeah, so from my perspective, yeah, you said that Core Web Vitals have been around for a year, and that is partially true. But at the same time, they are like the search page experience bit is like only recently started to roll out, as far as I know. I don't know a ton about that, but I heard they recently started to roll that out, and I think that this is potentially the the rubber meets the road part, where folks will start paying more attention and will hear more about the places where they are less than ideal. I think that yeah, like Katie said, Core Web Vitals, on the one hand, we can't have a small number of metrics covering everything. There must be some compression to the information exposed. But at the same time, the assumption is that they can be improved, and they will be improved over time. So right now, I think that they're working well for most cases. There must be some cases where we will find out that we need to improve them, and that's okay, and yeah, by design.
And like I guess a specific example of that would be the rollout of the CLS update. For those unfamiliar, originally CLS looked at all the layout shifts over the lifetime of the page. It was realized that was unfair to single page applications. And so now CLS just looks at layout shifts that occur within a small window of time. So that's an example of the spirit of the metric, and a lot of like the calculations have remained the same, but it's been tweaked to be better. And that's, I think, to be expected.
So if you're able to give us a look behind the curtain to the extent to which you're able to share this, how do you arrive at these metrics as the determination for performance? So I guess to bring in a sort of a parallel topic as well, one of the questions is, there was sort of a couple funny riffs I saw on Twitter once where people were saying they talked to a customer and wanted to improve like their time to first byte. And the customer was like, that's not a core web vital, doesn't matter. And I know that's a bit flippant, and obviously we can probably understand how that's incorrect, but I'm kind of curious how we arrived at these core web vitals, and then to pair off of that, how people should interpret what other metrics might also, of course, be relevant in web performance.
Yeah, so I can take that. I think that the original thinking, and I wasn't part of the team when the program started, but I think the original thinking was around creating metrics that cover 3 different orthogonal dimensions. So there's visibility or render performance, there's interactivity, and there's the user experience bit and user annoyance, which is reflected by CLS. So like for render performance, we have LCP. For interactivity, we have first input delay, and for user experience, we have CLS. And those are the metrics that were picked by, I believe, just going through a large number of samples where the user experience was subpar, or like a large number of sites and displaying videos to real-life users, and then seeing which metric correlates best with what the users were seeing as most objectionable from a performance perspective. So that's the way that the metric, like the metrics were originally worked out and picked, and there were many candidates. And I know that, for example, for the time to first byte example, maybe in this case, FCP would have been a better proxy for this particular case, but LCP proved to be like covering more ground when it comes to like both the time to first byte of the HTML as well as the largest media on the page that is often unoptimized, and that has a large impact on the experience. So, but to go back to the example of a site that doesn't care about metrics that are not part of Core Web Vitals, that seems like something that is very short-sighted. And I would expect that site to like be surprised by future Core Web Vitals or by future changes. And if they ignore their current performance problems, future metrics may cover them. But at the same time, they are impacting their own business metrics by not caring. So I would expect sites that are aware of the impact of performance on business metrics beyond just Core Web Vitals and page experience to also care about those bits, maybe in a lower priority than issues that are impacting Core Web Vitals, but they should still care just for their own selfish reasons.
Yeah, so I kind of think of this, I analogize things like Core Web Vitals and some of this kind of connection between the real world lived experience and this very, very succinctly summarized takeaway about it to TLS, right? Like you get a padlock maybe still today inside of your URL bar. And what does that mean? Well, it means a great number of things. It means you picked a cipher suite that was correct. You picked, or in a range of cipher suites that are correct, you picked a version of the protocol that is still supported by the browser. You picked, a good certificate that is connected to the public PKI chain correctly, right? Like it passed all of these tests to get there. And there are a bunch of things that may in the future get pulled into TLS, and there are a bunch of things that may eventually filter out of TLS. And if you think about that green padlock as sort of summarizing all of those properties all at once, but is still an ever-changing definition under the covers, that's kind of where Core Web Vitals gets you. You kind of have to be in that range to be considered to be good. And the good news for that developer is going to be like that may be reflecting some ignorance on the part of the customer, but if they can demonstrate that good TTFB improves largest contentful paint, then suddenly they have a way to say making this connection helps us out. And so to the extent that the Core Web Vitals are picked out of that big soup of metrics that are available to refine and work on, the strength of their eventual indication of a good user experience hopefully helps you as an engineer or as a practitioner connect them to the experience of the business too. It won't always be a straight line, but like that's the hope.
And like I wasn't there in the room for the original picking of the Core Web Vitals, but I think part of the reason why like these 3 Core Web Vitals exist and something that would affect if there's ever going to be more Web Vitals is I think the current Web Vitals are intended to be fairly close to the user experience. So for instance, using time to first byte as an example, like time to first byte is probably going to help a lot of things, but it doesn't necessarily like directly impact user experience. Whereas largest contentful paint, your typical user doesn't know what that is. It doesn't know how it's defined, but like that is something that is perceived by the user. And same thing with layout shifts and first input delay. Like they're all very perceptible parts of the user experience. And like that's the whole reason like why they're being rolled into the search algorithm is that it's part of a better experience. You have kind of touched on this. I'm guessing part of how they came about is, so I've been testing like some of the, like, for instance, the CLS updates. How that works is the team will send out like basically a page that shows like 2 page experiences next to each other. You watch them and say which one's a better user experience. And my guess is, and then in doing that data collection, that's where they came across this idea of layout stability. I think CLS is interesting because it's for Core Web Vitals, like no one ever talked about it, but as soon as like someone put like some words to it, it's like, oh yeah, that like annoying thing. Like we all know it's been like a phenomenon on the web for years, but it was just never like, kind of quantifying it in names. So yeah, I think user experience is a big part of the Core Web Vitals.
So something I think, Katie, you touched on very briefly when talking about the evolution of CLS is, that it had to be changed because longer running user sessions using a SPA framework were getting unfairly, negatively dinged. So that brings up a question for me that like the Core Vitals seem to really focus very heavily on that initial load. Are there tools, are there new metrics coming that are going to be helpful for folks who work on a SPA to better measure the long running effects of a user having the browser open for a long time, navigating around, asynchronously loading content, things like that?
I'll jump on this one, but you might have more comments here. I think probably the long-term version is to improve the Core Web Vitals to like better to take into account the whole page experience, not just that loading experience. And I think once like the metrics are in place, then like, the tooling and all the stuff that follows from that, and then people start caring about that aspect.
So one way to maybe think about how these metrics are being developed, like Yoav mentioned the incredible amount of care that Annie Sullivan and Tim Dresser and Deep on the team have put into, making sure that from a statistical perspective, these things have a strong relationship to what we expect from the user perspective. But that kind of all works back from what is the experience that we're trying to get developers to deliver, right? And I think if we sort of have an intuitive notion of what that is over time, we can start to see how the multi-page architecture and the single-page architecture should be able to be measured by the same metrics. So like if you think about Gmail, I always think about how there is the HTML version of Gmail, and then there's the JavaScript version of Gmail. And I can do almost everything that I want to do in both versions. So I should, for all intents and purposes, be able to have metrics that ascribe the same value to the same quality of experience, no matter how I got there. If it's a forum post that's refreshing off the server, and I put like maybe some server interaction lag in play, maybe that's worse in some cases on some networks some of the time. Probabilistically, if I have the JavaScript loaded, it takes a long time to load, but eventually a bunch of my session interactions go better, then maybe that's great. I kind of think of this as trying to recreate what game developers do, right? Where you launch the game, it's running at 60 frames a second. The moment you do it, you tap the button, you get an instant response, hopefully, and you're always kept in a loop where the system is reacting to your interactions from that initial boot up moment forward with very low latency. It may not have solved the issue. It may not have fixed doing what you told it to do. It may not have finished the task, but it will at least get back to you and say, hey, by the way, I'm working on it. And it will not prevent you from taking future interactions while it's doing that work. And so if you think about that kind of an interaction where it's always responsive, and once you're past the first hurdle, that's the kind of thing we want developers to be able to deliver. And so the metrics are kind of derived from that kind of an experience and try to measure all of these architectures under sort of equivalent, an equivalent skeptical eye towards what the user is experiencing and the distance from where we are to that.
Yeah. So there's definitely on the SPA measurement front, there's currently no way for us to measure soft navigations, and for us is in a way the broader web performance community. There's no way, like you can have framework specific or application specific user timings that tell you when the user clicked and when the thing you wanted to happen have happened. But that is very site-specific. It's not generally something that even run providers can collect, and definitely not browsers when it comes to data collection, because it's like the logic is very specific. And I think that the first path to or I don't know first, but one angle of solving this blind spot is to solve that reporting. There's a bunch of work happening on app history, on the app history API, that will make soft navigations significantly more deliberate when it comes to the causal connection of user clicked on a link that was a semantic element that then did something, changed the URL, and then the developer can resolve a promise whenever they think that the thing has happened, and that is something that is reportable in a standard way as part of the performance, like as a performance observer entry, and can be collected by run providers, can be collected by browsers. Then there are additional layers to add on top of that in terms of like, I'm not sure that this will give us the full picture we need for soft navigation reporting in Core Web Vitals, but it will be a good stepping stone in that direction. Yeah, at the same time, like the move of CLS from a full lifetime of the page metric to a more windowed approach is also an approach that can enable us to to have a more like metrics that are on the one hand considered across the entire lifetime of the page, but at the same time more fair. And we can apply that same logic when we're looking into responsiveness metrics that are supposedly would be the next generation of FID if all goes well. And yeah, so there are multiple things that we can do on that front, and we are actively working on that.
Yeah, and I think it seems like what's missing, like you're right, is that being able to track soft navigation, which is something that I've sort of done with like custom user marks in the past, to pull a history and say, okay, at what point did the user like tap the pagination button and we switch pages. I think maybe the other thing that's missing is like element render timing for more types of elements to like understand when something appears visually on the screen.
So yeah, so we have element timing as a web performance API. Are you saying that there are cases where it's
like,
not sufficient, or?
Oh no, I mean, though, that's like, seems to me like that those are the pieces that we would need to like put together a long running performance monitoring of like a spa.
Yeah.
Okay. I wanted to jump. We're almost tangential to this other question that was coming up in the chat, and they've been waiting patiently. So I thought I would bring it up now. We could jump back to the rest of the Web Vitals chat, but we have a team with us today, and they're dealing with sort of a really particular issue. And I don't know that we'll be able to comment to their particular issue, but I think there's a broader conversation topic maybe to be had here. So they're talking about using a web view in Cordova, using things like fast DOM, debouncing, will change, but yet they're still having some issues with smooth scrolling in their application. So my question for the panel here is, for teams that are doing a lot for, and the reason why I brought this up is because this is sort of while running. It's not load performance, but this is while the application's running. If they feel like they're doing everything that they know how to do and throwing it at it, and they're at the point where they're asking if it's just a browser bug or what advice do you have for teams that are in this situation as to how they can get the next piece of data that might lead to the real fix, how they can reach out to the right teams, whether this is something that should be brought up to a browser team with a bug repro? Like, what should a team do in a situation like this when they just have that pesky performance issue that no matter what they throw at it, they cannot seem to make headway?
I would say start with a standalone test case. If you can prove that, a very slim page that does nothing other than the small number of operations you want it to do is hitting those performance problems, that's a very strong case towards a browser bug rather than just you're throwing too much JavaScript on low-end users or like low-end devices. That would be the place where I would start. And if that is successful, then a Chrome bug and tagging the right component would probably get the right folks' attention to that. And if you don't know what the right component is, just hit up any of your friendly Chrome people that are on Twitter or elsewhere, and they will find the right people for you.
Adding to that, I will say that competition drives browsers. And so if you can also show that this reduced test case is slower in Chromium than some other engine, please note that. Because, you know, nothing gets a browser engineer out of bed in the morning like finding out that there's a benchmark to win. I'll also note that if you are not familiar with how to take DevTools traces or Chrome or /edge / tracing traces, you know, submitting those with your issue or your report can be very clarifying. The trace is something that the person who's assigned the bug will eventually have to go take on their own. So anything you can do to shortcut that process to help ensure that the analysis is easy to understand and repro will go a long way.
One more thing from my lazy experience. If you put in a link to a reproducible test case, that's significantly easier than asking people to install your tool chain in order to reproduce it. So it's just like, it saves time on the...
Easier, and also like in some cases, like you can't duplicate someone else's build environment. It's almost impossible. Yeah. So like emphasis, I think, on the being able to reproduce it, you know, like on a glitch or, you know, something in a simplified environment.
Yeah, CodePen over NPM any day.
All right, great. So jumping back, I guess, to Core Web Vitals, one of the other topics that I had seen while doing some research that I thought was interesting was an article or a discussion around Core Web Vitals showing different measurements in like what they would call a lab environment versus in the production environment. And I guess maybe this shouldn't have been surprising, but yet somehow I was still fascinated to read about it. I was curious if you all have experienced this, if you can help people understand what that is, and then maybe also kind of give a pitch for what people should be doing to maybe, obviously you want to do some stuff before production, but also to have the right tool chain in place to be able to catch this if something is different in their production or pre-production environment.
Absolutely not a bug, and I would say maybe go as far as say like that's expected. You, even if you test multiple permutations in a lab, that's totally different. There are like, you know, bajillion permutations out in the wild, not just like, you know, device type and connection type, but like little things like one example I think of is like where on the page a user enters can affect the LCP element. So if they're halfway down the page, that image that is halfway down the page is the LCP element, versus if they're at the top of the page, like little details like that, you're probably not thinking to test that, and you maybe probably shouldn't even. But those are all those things like add up and are going to cause field data to look different than your lab data. So I think lab data is good to get a like pulse on things before they ship and catch things, but you're never going to perfectly emulate field data. And so with that in mind, I'm trying to think like what advice I would give here is just know that's to be expected. And therefore it's good to have field data in place, you know, because they're different. If you're only relying on lab data, you're going to be missing a lot of things, and just like have a process in place to be looking at and reviewing what is coming in from the fields. And some people may also find it helpful to like, you know, add debugging information in the field so they can get a better sense of what's going on.
Yeah, I'll say that every time I consult with a team that's got questions along these lines, if they've got a product in the market already, you can start by collecting things like the network information API data about effective connection type, that sort of thing. You can start to collect information about core count. You can start to like build some sort of a picture of the sort of geographical layout of the user base, and that can help you in setting your expectations. But like Katie says, there's no replacement for this. The best case scenario is one in which you are happily surprised, right? Where you have set a conservative baseline, you've built a performance budget, and what it turns out is that the user base that you're deploying to is actually significantly more able to handle the content that you're throwing at it rather than less so, because over the life of a project or a page, right, it's probably going to grow in size. So leaving something for you to grow into over time is great. and not having to count on the ecosystem getting better ahead of you, especially as third parties come into your product. That's a great outcome, because the alternative is one where you're having to try to trim just to stay afloat. And if I have a concern with industry practice today, it's that it leaves too many teams in that situation where they find themselves on the back foot, scrambling to stay ahead of things, when maybe they couldn't have known better, but the tools certainly should have set them up for success.
Yeah, so a couple more notes. I think that Lab, on top of pre-shipping tests, I think Lab is great for iteratively fixing your performance. So if you see a problem in the lab, you can quickly iterate over it rather than try something out, deploy, and then looking at the data the next day or month, depending on what your field, like where your field data is coming from. So Lab is great for that. And to supplement what Alex said, it may be wise to calibrate your lab data. So run your own lab, and then calibrate it according to what you see in the field. So if you have that discrepancy in your own lab, change your own lab to match the field better, and match whatever percentile you want to fix in the field to match your lab, and then you can quickly iterate over that.
I just want to quickly respond to Simon Hearn's point about using the current set of geographic and connection data and all the other proxies that you can collect today being totally accurate. Simon's dead on. A lot of businesses may find themselves starting from a very slow perspective, and they may have a hysteresis. They may have a blindness because a lot of users who may have come to their site may have already bounced off of it and may choose not to come back as a result of having had a bad time. And you won't discover those users unless you introduce something significantly faster to them. And so it's important to keep that in mind, that while you're setting your baseline right now, that may always be in play if the thing that you're testing against is not particularly quick.
I wanted to briefly kind of dig a little bit deeper into something that Alex, I think, mentioned very briefly, but the problem of third-party code. So this has been kind of another big topic where it's difficult to sometimes manage and monitor and control the third-party code on your site. I was wondering if folks here have any suggestions or ideas on how best to corral and understand the impact of third-party code.
That's a hard problem, and that's another place where Lab shines, because in field data, like RUM data as well as Crux, you won't necessarily see what third parties loaded, how much bandwidth they consumed, how much long tasks they triggered, because this is all information that is not necessarily because everything that's running in a cross-origin iframe is somewhat invisible from a RUM perspective, unless very specific and very complex opt-ins happens that don't typically happen. And this is something that is on the Web Performance Working Group's radar to fix to some extent. I'm hopeful that new primitives like cross-origin isolation would enable us to have more visibility into third-party iframes that opted in to say that they don't contain any sensitive information using cross-origin isolation primitives. Maybe there are other ways to also enable, for example, cores opted in resources to also expose them. But essentially today, there's a big gap in RUM when it comes to third parties. And there's definitely a lot of thinking happening regarding ways to solve that. Right now, Lab is your best bet, but that's also varies because third parties can vary by geo, and maybe where your lab is not where your users are. So again, going back to trying to correlate the lab as close as possible to your users is, with all the caveats that Simon mentioned, is probably a good idea on that front as well.
So how I think third parties is, in the long term, I'm hopeful that maybe like the platform can introduce like new primitives and like better ways of kind of wrangling third party. And also maybe things like Core Web Vitals will put pressure on some third parties to either clean up their code, give you more options and control over, the performance. In the interim, I think ultimately with third parties, like since you can't control their code, like there's a lot of things you can't control. My advice to people is like really pay attention to how you're loading that code. Like, are you, like I see a lot of things like people have like, not to say it's stupid, like a low priority chat widget, and it's like the second request on their site, and that should not be it. Like going through your scripts, seeing the order that they're loaded. Are you loading everything asynchronously that you should? Another thing is using lazy loading. Looking to do things like that to try to, like, if you can't control their impact, at least push off the impact, or like try to only incur the performance costs when necessary, using techniques like that. Or taking a look at your third-party code and seeing if you can switch it out. Like, is there a lighter weight library? Is there a similar product that has a better performance footprint? That kind of thing. Are those third parties even needed in the first place, etc.?
I wanted to grab another quick take from chat, because I thought I also had this in my list of topics, and I've been wondering about it recently, which is to say, the question was how many apps use web workers? I felt like web workers for a little while seemed like they were going to be the thing. And there was even talk about trying to find ways to get frameworks to run in web workers and move a bunch of stuff out. And I feel like at least the speed of the conversation seems to have petered out. That doesn't mean that there's not really cool things happening in this space, but just feels like a lot of people aren't talking about it and bragging about it. Where are web workers in the performance conversation? Is it still is it a critical part? Is it something that we're just not leveraging enough? How should people see that, and how does that fit into the web performance toolkit?
So loading code into web workers is still quite challenging. I think that's the basis of a lot of the kind of impedance mismatch between where they might get used in an ideal world and where we are today. Someone in the chat mentioned Surma's excellent comlink library, which does make it much easier to sort of marshal the conversations across the worker boundary, which I think is incredibly valuable. So if you're looking to try to break up long tasks and move some of that work out to a place where it can't block responsiveness, web workers can help you a lot there. From my perspective, and this is just a very personal view, our community is stuck at the very beginning of the conversation. Right, web workers are a thing that will become important as we get into the things that Yoav was alluding to earlier around upgrading our metrics for interactivity. So, started at TTI, now we've got first input delay, which is a big improvement over TTI. Thank goodness we have FID. And then we'll eventually get to something like total blocking time or its successor too. And in that world, maintaining responsiveness throughout the entire application's lifetime will turn into a key conversation point, and moving work off the main thread is a very important tool in the tool chest for addressing that kind of a challenge. We have also some primitives issues, right? Like I think Christopher Baxter's in the chat here, and he did a bunch of work over the years to try to figure out how to do work that sort of matched in a worker where you would try to apply it in the DOM. To try to isolate some of the overhead of some of the libraries we've got today that are very much DOM oriented or sort of like DOM centric, but in a very slow way. Like, there's a whole generation of libraries that are designed around the idea of slow virtual DOM updates rather than just doing the diffs directly. And those libraries are going to have a real challenging time moving to a different threading model. So making it easier to just correlate work across that boundary is going to be something that the platform will have to bite off. Getting input to happen into workers is also not something that we know how to do yet. I think it's coming because of some work that's happening over in games and 3D and XR scenarios where extraordinarily low latency is the name of the game. And I know that there's work happening to try to make that happen. But to make work really happen in the worker, basically the full set of APIs that you were going to use to do the work kind of has to be available inside the worker context, and we're just kind of not there yet. So there's a bunch of reasons that you could use, and I think it's situational as to which of them explains why we're not there yet. But I would say that it's going to be a while before we've got our own house in order enough to really take advantage of workers in a way that's going to improve web applications significantly.
Yeah, basically what Alex said, plus the fact that I remember various performance studies that essentially saw that there's a ton of advantages for moving work off of the main thread into a worker. There's also some overhead. So there are some situations where it's beneficial and some situations where you probably just want to finish the work off in the main thread. And right now, it's almost impossible to run code that makes that decision dynamically. Like, you have to make that decision ahead of time and load the code into the worker into a separate, like, it's a separate destination. I'm not even sure that caching works, or at least like not as it should. And this is something that it feels like we need to improve as a platform in order to enable workers for reals. And Surma has been doing a ton of great work in pushing various proposals on that front that will enable to move code from main thread to worker and the other way around. And I think I would love to see progress on that.
I'll say that Shu is also working on proposals at TC39 for a surface syntax that might eventually make it easier to describe code in a JavaScript module that will eventually be loadable over in a different context without much difficulty. That's the kind of thing where I think to get code sharing, so even at like the function body level, it's going to be much easier to go that route. So we're some distance off.
Awesome. So we want to pivot. Alex, you mentioned we're still at the beginning. So we want to bring everybody to the beginning and talk about people that are either just starting out in their careers or just starting out in web performance. And one of the things that I think is interesting is that while there are amazing tools like web.dev, for anybody that hasn't been to web.dev, there is so much great content there, especially for framework. If you're using a framework, there's a ton of great framework tips for performance there as well. Of course, Lighthouse and WebHint are great tools. But I think when people start to really get into it and they start looking in the developer consoles and looking at flame graphs, or they look at waterfall charts in web page tests or other tools, I think what I've noticed is there's just sort of a lack of educational materials on how to read these, how to interpret these correctly. There doesn't seem to be a lot of great examples of, this is the thing and this is how I interpret it and this is how you should interpret it. Maybe they do exist and they're just not, I just haven't seen as many of them, and the people that I talk to haven't. But how should people learn this? And is there any work being done to maybe put out more educational materials to bring people up to speed on these technologies?
I'll just
I do think that's a whole, like, I've noticed, like, reading flame charts is such an important thing, but like I can't think of anything. Like, there's like occasional like thread on web page test, or something. But it doesn't exist. I've often wondered whether that's worth creating. I'm sure it's worth creating, but yeah.
So I remember back in the day, Paul Irish used to do live perf audits on YouTube, and that was, I think, a super educational piece of material. Seeing things now from inside of Google, I think it's complex for Google folks to run performance audits of other people's websites, or even for Google properties. It can raise like folks may be unhappy. So there is some like a complex political question of how do we show this. What I've seen recently is Tim Cadillac of Catchpoint and Web Page Test is running sessions on Twitch, which seem like the right answer for this specific question nowadays. But yeah, it's hard to do that in a way that doesn't disparage the content author in a like as well that is also public. So it's it's tricky. There's a tricky balance there.
Yeah,
And often, like, I think go ahead, Alex.
I was just going to say, I think we're in the apprenticeship phase, right? There will eventually be a phase where, you know, we've got maybe a better class of tools that make it easier to boil down some of the insights. But right now, we're in a place where people teach each other, and so what I would say is, you know, if you are interested in this sort of thing, my experience of the web performance community, especially, like, you know, there's the web performance chat over on Discord now. These communities are extraordinarily open and welcoming. It is still a small community. You know, the debates that happen are extremely grounded. And the people who are there to teach and learn about how to diagnose an issue, which thankfully can almost always be objective, right? Like, it's not just sort of like, you know, throwing a question into a political soup and hoping someone comes away with the best priors. It's more like, well, we can show that this is doing this, and then we have a causal question, and we can just go boil it down. It is the nicest form of engineering in that sense, and it allows people to be very generous. And so I would say, if this is something you really want to do, you know, reach out and find some of the very kind of people who would be willing to share their time with you and become a performance investigator. Think of it like becoming a co-investigator. You know, Holmes doesn't solve all of the cases by himself. He has to have Watson around. So if you'd like to become a co-investigator, I'm sure there are people in the community who would love to work with you.
Yeah, I will say, as someone who stumbled upon the perf community, that it is absolutely the kindest, most welcoming group of folks ever, and I've been very happy to be a part of it. And thank you all for being so welcoming. Cool. So I think, kind of to take us a little bit farther along, so some other questions that have come up are about content management systems, and how a lot of times we're getting multimedia content in our projects and our sites that's coming from a content management system that maybe is like a giant, you know, 2 or 3 megabyte image that, you know, the folks aren't aware of the potential impacts. Do you think is that an area that folks should be focusing on more? Is that something that, or any advice on how we manage our budgets when we have these CMS systems that could be really dropping anything in the page?
I guess there's a couple pieces there. I would think what I've run into kind of being in that situation is sometimes, maybe as engineering or someone who cares about performance, you want to use a smaller image, but there's maybe pushback from product or design. And so I'm hoping that Core Web Vitals will kind of help, like, get everyone on the same page about that. But I'm not sure. There's another part of your question is like, does the CMS support the smaller images? And if they don't, then that's a problem. I think the cost of images, like on a per byte, is lower than, say, JavaScript. But when you're talking about images of a certain size, and like, yes, it matters. You know, even on a fast connection, that's going to have an impact.
It's also worth maybe looking to see what you can do around the edges there. So I think, you know, Katie's dead on about the cost of this stuff, right? But maybe you can implement lazy loading in a way that only changes the output of when the stuff occurs on the network, you know, and gets some things out of contention. And then, you know, the good news is that we've got a pretty vibrant set of services in the world that will take your images and put them through a CDN and optimize them for you. If you can't do better, maybe you can just change out the URLs that you're serving them from and cache them through the CDN the other way. Yoav, is there anything I'm missing there?
No, basically, the only way to have your media and like images and media in general optimized is to automate it. Either you automate it at the CMS level, if you can. If you can't, yes, there are a lot of great image CDN services that can do that for you. And yeah, and beyond just optimizing the assets, yeah, there's how you deliver them. For everything that is outside the viewport, lazy loading is definitely the answer. for things that are inside the viewport, lazy loading can actually make things worse because the images, like the image request gets kicked off later in the page's lifetime. So for those in viewport images, and what's in viewport is a tricky definition because there are many different viewports, and not all images are in all viewports. But for those images, you really need to optimize them, and you need to automate it in order for that to happen consistently. So, yeah, either pick a CMS that does that, or an image optimization service, or roll your own optimization that compresses those images and caches them, which depending on your scale and whether this is your core competency or not.
I wanted to pull in another question from the chat, which is, we've talked a lot about browsers and the web, but a lot of people are interacting with web renderers through tools like Cordova or Ionix Capacitor or Electron. And so a lot of web development these days happens not inside of a browser, or at least seemingly not inside of specifically Chrome or whatever else. People have been asking and kind of curious about what of the tooling and the techniques and the thoughts that we've shared so far translate. Are there unique challenges that you all are aware of that you could make people aware about, or things that pertain to JavaScript code or web code or tools that are happening outside of the browser?
So I can tell you that in the browser I work on now, I'm looking at bits of our UI that are built in WebTech but are served off of disk, right? It's kind of the description of this. That is to say, I'm putting some stuff on the screen. It's going to render out as HTML, JavaScript, and CSS. It thinks it's talking to URLs, but it's actually loading from disk. And I'll say that pretty much everything that you would expect to be a problem on kind of a low-end device when you've got a PWA installed with the service worker shows up here too. Speed of disk, speed of CPU, ability to parallelize the content it's parsing and updates, and then the metrics that you're going to want to care about in terms of blocking time. Right? We've got FID, which is kind of the core web vitals metric that we apply today, but total blocking time as an evolution of that will capture more of this kind of game style loop where it's I tap the button, I want the response in the next frame. I tap the button, I want the response in the next frame. And any JavaScript between you and generating that next frame can potentially delay that. So those are the kinds of metrics that I think are going to be important here, but they are also important to PWAs and to other things that have service workers. I won't say app cache because hopefully that's going to get ripped out any second now. But if you happen to have a cached experience, I think they kind of have a lot of symmetry. At least they do when the traces that I look at. They don't seem miles different. I will say that the only place where I would get a little bit worried is if you're in a configuration of a browser engine that is different to the one that the browser engineers are tuning for. You can hit different cliffs. So there was a time, for instance, where WebView used a different threading model for putting bits on screen. And that meant that the compositor was running in a different mode that was lower performance in some ways until the APIs changed. That's not the case anymore for Android web views, but it was before. And so if you find yourself in a persistent case that you can't repro between the browser and this other environment, you may be in a case where you need to go ask the person who constructed that environment what the threading model is, how the graphic system works, and get your hands on that. But my go-to move is to try to move these things into the browser and debug them there. And if you can, that works out pretty well.
Awesome. All right. Well, I think we're starting to wrap up here. So I think it would be really great to kind of end on a future-facing note. So I'm curious, maybe each of the panelists could go around and talk about, what do you think the next big thing in web perf is going to be, or what is something that's coming down the pipeline that you're excited about, or what do you think doesn't exist that should exist that you can see at coming to us at some point in the future. So what do you think the future of web performance looks like? I don't know who wants to start.
I guess I can start. I hope, or I think, just the idea of caring about performance and performance monitoring is kind of going to become widespread. It's no longer going to be this niche idea. I'm hopeful that I think maybe we'll see some improvements in third-party performance. And then just vaguely, like I thinking back, like how, what the web was like 5 years or 10 years ago, like it does look very different. And I'm, hoping maybe with Core Vitals and some of this other stuff, getting people to care more, that hopefully like even maybe in just a year or two, we'll look back and be like, wow, this is, so much faster, or it's a better experience. And maybe that's just wishful thinking, but one of the things I find most neat about the web is it can move very quickly. So I'm hoping that maybe a year from now, the everything will look pretty different.
Yeah. So yeah, from my perspective, I'm similarly hopeful that Core Web Vitals can make a dent and make people care, and that I don't know, like what's the time range of the future, but that 1 to 5 years from now, it will be obvious that you need to care for your web performance, similarly to the way that it's obvious today that you need to put your site on HTTPS and make sure that it's secure, and make sure you apply your patches for it not to be breached, and blah, blah, blah. So I'm hopeful for that future. On a more technical sense, I have many things that I think we can do better as a platform in order to reach that future. And yes, third-party accountability is high on that list, as well as better way to prioritize resource loading and make sure that the prioritization is actually respected. We made a few attempts at that, but because it involves both client and server, it's hard and it takes time. But if we're talking about the future, maybe we can pull that off. Better primitives to load images, because right now, yes, we have some, like we mentioned lazy loading and how it's hard to correctly apply it. And like when it comes to in or out of viewport, and maybe we can figure out like easier ways to do that. So I'm hopeful for a future where people care about performance. At the same time, the platform makes it easier for them to align the way that they write code with performant code. And right now, that's not like, we're not 100% there, and I'm hopeful that we can get there.
Yeah, I think to echo that and sort of think about how Core Vitals will work in the marketplace, right? Like Katie's vision is one where we have caused businesses to care. And my hope is that that trickles down into the marketplace for tools. Today, my view is that the tools and techniques that web developers talk to each other about are both on the one hand potentially well predicated, but on the other hand, they're mispriced. So it may be the case that we need some of the tools that we're currently using, in some of the cases that we say that we need them, but we may be paying way too little for them, right? The externalities that come along with them. If you think of sort of like the social cost of carbon being mispriced, it's kind of the same thing. The social cost of JavaScript is being mispriced. And so the amount that we can actually afford is potentially quite a lot lower than we acknowledge. And once those limits start to kick, it's going to change the market for tools pretty dramatically. And I am excited for that, because it's going to mean that there's going to be a whole new explosion. We're going to move off of this kind of assumption of SSR plus, a big hydration step, and then a bunch of other things to glue over the idea that we have to have a single page app, even when multi-page would be significantly better. And in that area, pushing out a little bit further, I think we've got a lot of great stuff coming down the pike in browsers to make building multi-page architectures significantly more fluid, more seamless. Page transitions, portals, all those sorts of things may add up together to a place where, because the prices look more realistic in terms of what the user can afford, we will put more effort and energy into both building and then correctly using the sorts of tools that will deliver lighter pages, because lightweightness is just this intense correlate with a good experience most of the time. So I'm optimistic about that.
Great. So that will pretty much wrap us up. As mentioned at the beginning, you can see the Twitter handles for all of the various panelists and hosts on the show today down below us. But I wanted to really quickly, before we completely close out, give a chance to do one more shout out for some of those in communities or Discord servers or Slack servers that were being discussed, and where people should go to find out more things about the things that we talked about today. So I don't know, Alex, if you wanted to pitch how people could maybe find the awesome web performance community that you were discussing, or where people should look to find some of these recordings that we talked about earlier and things like that.
So Yoav hinted at Tim Kadlik's web page test recordings. That's sort of an ongoing series now. And I'll just put a plug in for web page test. It's the best, most reliable way to make reproducible traces that you can share with your team and compare across runs. It is a gem. It is an app, like, thank God for web page test. It's so great. The web performance community is again very welcoming. There's a more recent public Discord, I think. I wouldn't exactly know the URL for it, but hopefully someone can fill it in later in the chat. But yeah, reach out, find people. If you don't find them, the DMs are open, I think, for at least myself and maybe some other panelists here, and we can help you along, right? We're still in that apprenticeship part of the curve, and I think everyone recognizes that means we have responsibility to the folks behind us.
Yeah, there's also a Slack community. I don't know what the overlap between that and
it may have been the Slack that I'm thinking of. I apologize.
Okay. Yeah, I can. Yeah, we can figure it out and then post a link. But yeah, I'm not sure how. Like, what's the process to join the Slack community? But it's super friendly and everyone are super helpful.
I can add in my colleague, Sergey Chernyshev, runs the New York Web Performance Meetup. He has still been going strong through all of COVID virtually. And as part of that, he hosts a Meet for Speed on a regular cadence where he has someone come and tell them the name of their website. And he will pull it up and go through a web page test run and walk through the waterfall. So that's another really good place to go. And I will also make a plug. Hopefully, we will once again have a Perf Matters conference. That was my entry into the Perf community, was speaking there. So again, hopefully once COVID, we can bring it back to life and have another one. And also performance.now in Amsterdam is another web performance conference that there's tons of videos from prior years online that folks can go find on YouTube and watch those.
Great. Well, that is going to do it for us today for this State of Web Performance. Thank you, everybody, for attending. Thank you so much to our panelists, Yoav, Katie, and Alex, for joining us. Thank you as well to Katie for being a co-host today. Of course, thank you to our sponsors, Progress, Kendo React, Dexecure, and This.Labs. Reminder, at This.Labs, we are hiring, so if you're interested, please reach out. And as we like to say, the conversation does not need to stop here. So as our panelists have said several times, please reach out with any additional questions, topics that you want to discuss, or just any of the things that were on your mind or that you wanted to react to from today's panel. Thank you again, everybody, and we will see you next time.
Thank you.
Yep, thank you. Bye-bye.